So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, host for this seminar. As a reminder, we are operating this in a hybrid format. Pleased to have a full room here for our seminar today, and pleased to have our friends and colleagues joining us on Zoom. We're thrilled to have with us today Catrina Rorke for her talk, Addressing the Carbon Loophole. Catrina Rorke is the Senior Vice President for Policy and Research at the Climate Leadership Council and Executive Director of the Center for Climate and Trade. In her role at the Council, she develops the details of the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends proposal, manages the Council's research program, and supports its advocacy and outreach activities. Prior to joining the Council, Ms. Rorke founded the Energy and Environment Program at the R Street Institute, a free market and limited government public policy organization where she served as Director of Energy Policy and Senior Fellow. She also founded the energy program at the Center-Right American Action Forum, an economic, domestic, and fiscal policy think tank. As a legislative assistant to former U.S. Representative Bob Inglis of South Carolina, Ms. Rorke helped develop the first Republican-sponsored carbon tax bill. I think it was in that capacity when we first met. Yeah. So it's a real pleasure to have Catrina with us here today. I had the honor of moderating a session for new members with Catrina, with my colleague Jim Stock, and with our friend Catherine Wolfram back in December, and thought it would be great to bring Catrina back for the Energy Policy Seminar. So Catrina, welcome back to the Harvard Kennedy School.
Thank you. I did almost forget my mic, so thank you for the prompt. Real pleasure to be with y'all today. What we're going to talk about is an area of increased attention in policymaking circles in DC, where I work, but also internationally. It is a relatively new area of policymaking, drawing a lot of interest. So what I want to do with you is sort of lay out, I guess, first, what is the carbon loophole? Why is that a climate challenge that we should be addressing? How are policymakers responding, and why? I do want to engage in a whole lot of conversation, and so please ask questions, both to sort of clarify the landscape, but also to give me ideas as we're engaging with policymakers who are changing the future of trade and climate policy. Before I dive in, I think it might help you to understand how I work on these issues for context of how I come to the conversation. And so a little bit about who I work for and how the Climate Leadership Council was founded in 2017 by a group of Republican elder statesmen aiming to secure support for a carbon policy that would introduce a carbon price in the United States, offer a dividend to American households, simplify the regulatory landscape so the carbon price drives emissions reductions, but also a hook to bring Republicans into the conversation, and a system of border carbon adjustments. Great ideas. We then spent 2.5 years with a group that we now call our founding members to figure out what we mean when we say those broad policy ideas. And so for an extended period of time, we would gather stakeholders from the business community, consumer-facing brands, auto manufacturers, banks, insurers, energy companies, environmental organizations, keeping us honest to the environmental ambition of our plan to cut emissions in half in the United States by 2035, and then influential individuals from across the political spectrum who are deeply invested in the policy, who had special expertise they wanted to lend. And we figured out how to describe that policy. And then we worked to advocate for it. One of the things we did was get the largest statement in the history of the economics profession in support of this concept. And so we worked really hard to build support in political circles, in the business community, with environmentalists. We try and thread the needle to figure out how to bring stakeholders together for policy change. I mentioned border carbon adjustments was part of this package. That was an area of increasing interest. And so in February of last year, I have no sense of time, we founded our Center for Climate and Trade. This center also takes that view, working with as many stakeholders as possible, but we don't know what the policy solution is. And so we're really sort of casting about to follow policymakers where they're trying to go, to communicate to stakeholders in the business, environmental, labor community about this landscape, and trying to bring together enough intellectual capital, analytical support to move the ball on policy with the support of the people who can make sure it is effective and achieves the results we're interested in. And this is a sampling of papers to show how we sort of weigh in. We lay the intellectual foundation for what's interesting. I'll go into some of the data for America's Carbon Advantage today. We do analytical research to sort of build understanding amongst our colleagues. And we take the opportunity, having convened so many interesting folks, to sort of narrow the aperture on what seems to be politically appetizing and effective. For example, we have our principles, and then we also try and answer technical questions. And so we have some legal analysis. What are the pathways in the trade system that we can use to advance the ball here? And so we're really trying to sort of cover the map on the intellectual foundation. That's the perspective I bring. I work principally with policymakers and stakeholders in DC. And so this might be less of an academic conversation. I invite you to ask imploring questions if I stay too high level. But let's talk about the issue of the day, which is the carbon loophole. Simply, the carbon loophole describes the portion of global greenhouse gas emissions associated with the manufacture of a good in one country for its consumption in another, the emissions associated with trade. That captures roughly 25% of global emissions. And the term comes from a 2018 sponsored by ClimateWorks. And so this is a term that comes from the climate community, but it hasn't really sort of captured the attention as a climate policymaking until now. So we're seeing this sort of open up. I will also say that analysis finds that the carbon loophole principally moves emissions off the balance sheets of climate ambitious countries, economies, and onto the balance sheets of manufacturers and exporters. This is a map of the largest climate flows. I know it's a lot to look at, but if you can see that the thickest arrows, the highest volume of carbon today is being exported from China. China is manufacturing a whole lot of goods that we end up consuming internationally. And while global trade is increasing between members of the global South for years, until I think 3 years from now, we might see it sort of tip away. But for years, the primary trade has been from global South to global North countries. And that is showing that as countries are adopting more climate ambitious, more environmentally ambitious policies at home, reducing the manufacture of energy intensive goods that require processes that end up impacting the environment. We are exporting the manufacture of those things to other countries, but we are not reducing our consumption of those goods, which means our consumption is still having an environmental impact, but we don't have policy balance sheets right now. We can't address it without a new form of policymaking through the trade system. And that's what I want to talk about. So as you take in this overwhelming spaghetti graphic, on average, G7 economies import about 15% more emissions than they produce domestically. The US is right on track with that. Canada is an outlier. It's an emissions exporter because it makes a lot of fuel. But then some of our G7 partners see really tremendous imbalances. So France has a largely decarbonized electricity system. They import 40% more emissions than they produce domestically. The UK, Italy, 30%. And so the value add of domestic facing decarbonization policies is eroding rapidly because the impact of their consumer market is not being addressed. This is what the carbon loophole is showing us. The sort of appetite for our climate ambition to access more emissions if we get more creative about the policies that we select to reduce global emissions. This is a global problem. And so only looking at what we can do domestically is having diminishing returns. And just one more point, another sort of bad map, but my Excel skills are limited. What I'm showing you here is the relative carbon intensity of economies. And if you remember the spaghetti graphic, we've got a whole lot of carbon leaving darker red countries. Darker red means that those economies are more carbon intensive than the United States. The sort of blue markets are less carbon intensive than the US. And because I'm bad at Excel, the gray countries don't have data. But what we see here is that we're not just squeezing the balloon. We're not just shifting the emissions associated with making steel or batteries from a G7 economy from the US overseas. We're actually squeezing the balloon and then increasing the amount of emissions required for that economic activity. We're seeing, this is a much more digestible version, we're seeing that we're shifting our consumption patterns to economies that just require more emissions to create the same dollar of value than we do. So this is the data from that map, but I'm only showing you USMCA, EU, BRIC countries, and a global average. And now I'm breaking out to sectors that are traded goods. Every red box is a sector in a country that requires more emissions than the United States to create the same dollar of value. A blue box, fewer emissions. The more we're trading with those red boxes, the more we're not just squeezing the balloon, we're increasing the environmental impact of our consumptive activity. This is why it's a pressing climate problem. If we don't address it, we're exacerbating the emissions associated with our economic activity. That is not what climate ambitious countries should be doing. And so I've studied this where data is available for more specific industries. And this pattern of the US being a leader in carbon intensity is pretty prevalent across energy intensive sectors. So chemicals were 10 to 40% more carbon efficient than leaders in creating bulk chemicals. So that means we can make plastics and solvents and like something that you're probably wearing or the phone in your pocket with fewer emissions as a result. I'll show you more data for the steel industry later, but this is a really interesting area. And this is what's helping sort of crack the political code, bringing more policymakers to the table, is that the US is already winning here. And so we'll talk about that, we'll unpack that a little bit more in a second. And now let's focus on the overlay with climate ambition. So I borrowed this from Climate Action Tracker. Forgive the maps, I use too many maps. But what we're seeing is that carbon exporting countries tend to be furthest behind in establishing emissions reduction targets and then implementing policies necessary to get there. And so this is important because as we're squeezing the balloon and shifting emissions overseas, we also sort of just have to accept where emissions growth is going to come from. By 2050, BRICS countries will have 4 times more emissions than G7 countries. By 2050, developing countries will have 7 times more emissions than G7 countries. And that's if NDCs are met, if countries are achieving emissions reductions. And so we need to be able to address this global challenge with new policy solutions. This is the really exciting opportunity from a climate perspective. And we'll talk about other perspectives that are weighing in here too. But we have to move fast. We are not on track to address greenhouse gas emissions at the scale and speed required. We need new tools. And so this is why addressing the carbon loophole is a really exciting area, a necessary area for policy. With trade tools, we can access 25% of global emissions, and we should probably try. So how are policymakers responding? Think of 2 options, generally sticks and carrots. Sticks has gotten the most attention so far, and so we're going to start there. I call sticks carbon import fees, policies that countries are suggesting to begin to charge imports for the emissions associated with their manufacture, a new system of accountability for the carbon intensity of the goods that you trade. So far, 9 markets have expressed interest in implementing policies that look like this, and it's not only markets that you would expect. So India is weighing in the conversation. We're seeing South Korea and Japan explore these policies, which is a really interesting implication for the Asian market. But the EU is implementing their carbon border adjustment mechanism. Indeed, it went into effect yesterday. And so now we have our first stick on the marketplace. In 2024, Taiwan is going to implement a new domestic facing regime with a border adjustment. The US is in negotiations with the European Union. I'll talk more about political activity in Washington around this. But there's a lot of interest. Together, these countries are more than 60% of the global economy, about half the emissions in the global economy. So we're really starting to make a difference here. I did some back of the envelope assessment. If the US is able to get their imports on track with domestic carbon intensity, we can cut our own greenhouse gas footprint 600 million tons. That's no small potatoes. If we work with our G7 partners to do the same, so that each of us are importing goods in line with domestic carbon intensity will cut global emissions 1.8 gigatons. That's about 5% of global emissions. It's a pretty powerful opportunity. And as a result, these countries are sort of paving the way for this new system of trade competition, trade cooperation towards addressing climate change. I think it's interesting to consider why interest has grown so quickly. And so we're going to study the US because there's some pretty interesting political dynamics. And let me start here. I'm showing you quotes from two people. There's an active May on this climate and trade subject. So in testimony before the House Select Committee on the Communist Party of China, Bob Lighthizer, former trade representative under President Trump, advocated for border carbon adjustments as a new system of accountability. A few weeks later, in an op-ed about industrial decarbonization, Brian Deese, NEC director for President Biden, advocated for border adjustments in the context of decarbonizing our domestic economy while creating jobs. And so for two different reasons, we're seeing people setting the economic policy agenda at the highest level of both parties, advocating for the same policy set. Intriguing. And so what we're seeing in DC is a conversation that's attracting a lot of support politically, and we'll unpack that, but a little bit about the what before we dive more into the why. The Biden administration is in negotiations with the European Union on something called the Global Arrangement for Sustainable Steel and Aluminum, the first policy of its kind to use a trade instrument to try to decarbonize global trade in commodities. They are aiming to have a resolution on this negotiation by October 31st. And so I'm speaking to you just a few weeks too early to tell you what's in it. But the idea is to address the carbon intensity of product and global non-market excess capacity, trying to prevent overinvestment in these energy-intensive industries by state-owned enterprises that are flooding the market with cheap goods, complicating decarbonization elsewhere. There's also the Prove It Act. The Prove It Act is a bipartisan piece of legislation already introduced in the Senate, I think also in May, that aims to study the relative carbon intensity of manufactured goods in the US, in 38 other markets, for the energy-intensive sectors, fuels, and then decarbonization technologies like solar cells, critical minerals for batteries, those sorts of things. Basically, the data I showed you earlier on the relative carbon intensity, but through the Department of Energy, focused on specific products for as many countries as we can have access to. That has bipartisan support. It was introduced by Senator Coons of Delaware, Senator Kramer of North Dakota. We're anticipating a House companion. The government did not shut down, and so I am actually anticipating a House companion to that piece of legislation soon. And that will come from Congressman Curtis and Congressman Peters of California. So again, bipartisan, working on the data foundation for this area of interest. We're also going to see some carbon import fees. Last Congress, there was a little bit of activity, and this Congress, a little bit of activity from Democrats. This Congress, we're going to see bipartisan action. And so we're awaiting something called the foreign pollution fee. That's from Senator Cassidy of Louisiana. He's been talking about it in the national press, so it's no secret. But he's working on drawing more Republicans into this area of climate policymaking. And that'll be a sort of Republican foundation, the foreign pollution fee from Senator Cassidy. Shortly thereafter, again, they've been talking about this in the press, it's no secret. Senator Whitehouse is expected to introduce the Clean Competition Act, a piece of legislation he's introduced before to start charging emissions for their carbon intensity, start charging imports for their carbon intensity. That's the Democratic companion. Transparently, they want to build a bench of Republicans and a bench of Democrats and start working on what a bipartisan solution would look like next year. So it's a pretty intriguing area of policymaking. Why? That's a good question. I've talked to you about the sort of climate motivation. There's a lot to gain there. That's what brings Senator Coons and Senator Whitehouse to the table. It's why groups like Sierra Club and EDF and NRDC are thinking about this space. But let's talk a little bit about the economic solution, and that boils down to the carbon advantage. Oh, I forgot to, these are quotes from some of the senators actively working on these policies on a bipartisan basis. I meant to have this up so you could read while I blathered at you. but I forgot. I'll be happy to share the slides later. But really deep interest with a variety of different perspectives from all of these senators actively working in this space. So this sort of economic opportunity comes down to the carbon advantage. I'm showing you here the steel industry. Steel is pretty far advanced in documenting relative carbon intensities of production. Part of that is that there's two pretty distinct ways to make steel. One is relatively carbon intensive and one is not. And the US is the cleanest major manufacturer of steel in the world, largely because we use a system that relies on recycled product, is electricity intensive in an environment where we've largely decarbonized our electricity grid, especially for industrial purposes. A whole lot of steel companies work hard to make sure energy supply is low carbon. And as a consequence, we see this. I've bifurcated the industry into flats and longs. Flats, think car doors; longs, think rebar. It is only important that there are different quality considerations. Flats tend to use a more carbon intensive pathway than longs do in the US, but also internationally. We're seeing huge advantage for the US economy. Major international competitors are using much more carbon intensive processes to make the same exact products. And as a consequence, if we introduce a system of carbon accountability, if we charge everybody's steel for its carbon intensity, we see new economic benefits for incumbent firms. Incumbent firms in a carbon intensive, energy intensive space. We've never seen a climate policy do that before. So it shows that if you start charging steel goods for their carbon intensity, we'll see sales of US made product increase 10%, new profits for incumbent firms in the steel industry, and we'll cut imports in half. That's always a hook for major manufacturers in the United States. And so this is really changing the political landscape because policies aiming for decarbonization are creating economic value for existing firms because of investments they have already made. It's pretty unprecedented. This angle is what's attracting a whole lot of folks to the conversation. It's precisely what Brian Deese was talking about in his op-ed. We're also seeing support for this from corners of the Republican Party. So Senator Kramer, sponsor of the Prove It Act, talks a lot about how US natural gas is lower carbon than Russia's, and so we should use that for geopolitical advantage in Europe. This sort of, the idea of monetizing an existing carbon advantage is bringing a whole lot of folks to the conversation. And then there's the geopolitical angle. You might remember many moons ago when I showed you that big carbon advantage table. Russia, China, India, they require 3 to 4 times the amount of emissions to create the same dollar value in the US. For some countries, that signals that we want to sort of work more closely, partner economically to accelerate decarbonization. For some partners, it signals an opportunity to hold them accountable and deleverage them on the geopolitical stage. And that's exactly sort of the tone that's coming to this conversation. This is a quote from an op-ed by General McMaster, National Security Advisor to President Trump, really thoughtful contributor to the space who recognizes that we can use our energy supply chains to sort of stabilize international energy supply chains, offer advantage to our economic partners, but also start sort of deleveraging our authoritarian rivals. And they know it. And so here I'm showing you 2 quotes, one from Russia, one from China, in response to the European CBAM, that policy that went into effect yesterday. Igor Sechin, the sort of Russia's oil czar, he observed that CBAM-like policies could cause, quote, incomparably greater damage to the Russian economy than sanctions that are principally designed to be economically damaging. That's pretty damning information. An economist at China's State Council Development Research Center evaluated the CBAM and identified that it can reduce Chinese GDP by 0.64 percentage points and cut 2.3 million jobs. Again, really transparent observation of their vulnerability in these circumstances. And that's opportunity for us to capitalize on in making policy that sort of tips the scales geopolitically, introduces a system of accountability, not just for climate, but for other reasons too. This is drawing into the conversation folks like Lighthizer and McMaster. And it doesn't hurt that it polls well. So I've been working in climate policy for a bit, and it's like a sort of sad joke that you'll pull climate policy and it'll be universally popular until you tell people they have to pay for it, and then nobody supports it, even folks deeply motivated by climate change. That's not true in this area of policymaking. We're also upending that. And so we did some polling. This is my most recent national polling, but I have partners who did state level polling. I can share more recent information if that's interesting. But we polled border carbon adjustment would charge a fee on imported goods from foreign countries based upon the carbon pollution that resulted from producing those goods. Robust bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats both in favor. And then we said, okay, but you have to pay for it. You have to pay for it, but it's going to onshore jobs. The second polling question, would you be willing to pay more for a product if you knew it was made in America and that paying more would help create jobs here by bringing more manufacturing and production back to America? And support went up. And so now we're not just seeing a willingness to pay, we're connecting decarbonization to the economic interest of the American electorate. And that's also changing how politicians can talk about climate policy, bringing new people into the conversation. That's pretty cool. Okay, those are the sticks. What about carrots? This area is not as well developed, so just two pieces of context maybe. This is a report from McKinsey looking at total spending to get to net zero, and it's highlighting a huge gap. We need $3.5 trillion a year in new spending to get to net zero. That's a lot of money. The G20 Global Infrastructure Project did a similar analysis, though their graphics are not as attractive. And they also found a similar gap. We need $17 trillion in infrastructure investment in Asia, $2 trillion in Africa, 5.1 trillion in the Americas. That's a lot of investment necessary to decarbonize these economies. This means that we need more trade, not less of it. And so introducing a system of climate accountability can't sort of cause trade retrenchment. We can't just use sort of economic nationalism as our pathway here. We need to figure out how to get more trade of what we want in the sort of global ecosystem so that we are actively decarbonizing the economies that will be responsible for emissions growth into the future, but also finding international markets for the things we're making here at home. And then this is some quotes from the May 2023 Leaders Summit of the G7. In their Clean Energy Economy Action Plan, they talked about an inclusive climate club. This is an idea that the G7 has been developing for a couple of years now. This is not a perfect forum to develop something like a climate club, but they're signaling an interest in developing trade policies to facilitate decarbonization, working with international partners to do so on a global basis. And then they're also sort of hinting that each country can adopt its own policies for domestic decarbonization. And we still need to find ways to work together to decarbonize global trade. So this presence of accountability isn't going to impose sort of top-down policies on individual markets. It's going to empower markets to decarbonize as they wish, and then figure out how to partner to also wring carbon out of global supply chains. This is, I think, a perfect encapsulation of how the global market is beginning to sort of digest what climate cooperation can look like. And we've also seen industry efforts trying to figure out how to do sustainable best practices, information sharing, green labeling programs, documenting the emissions associated with industrial practices. So World Steel, IEA, OECD, all working on those initiatives. And then there's the VALARS framework, a bunch of sort of friends to the WTO, to the global trading system. I'm trying to imagine how to remake the trading system for a more sustainable future. So a lot of promising pathways to figure out how to use this moment to get more trade in what we want to see in the global environment at the same time that we're introducing a system of accountability for folks who are contributing excess emissions because they're not decarbonizing fast enough. That's the landscape. I'm really happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Catrina.
Thank you.
So I'll start with the first question and then open it up for the audience here. Sometimes when we look at the sort of the theory, sort of the game theory that's applied to international environmental agreements and carbon border adjustments, the argument is made, you want to threaten to impose a tariff on your trade partner, but hope to never actually do it. That what you want to do is change their behavior. You want them to implement something comparable to you. In a sense, that's kind of what the EU is trying to say. And I think in response to the EU's proposal for the CBAM, as you noted, we now have to start reporting.
Yeah.
That will then serve as sort of the foundation for when you have to start paying tariffs in a few years' time. It seems like we've seen kind of two types of responses that are both in motion.
Yeah.
One is, oh, wait, I want to export to the EU. I need to get a little bit more serious about my domestic climate policy. So some of their trade partners have done that. And then we see the United States says, we want to negotiate a different deal with you. And that is, in a sense, what this ongoing negotiation on steel and aluminum is. So part of that, one way to interpret that is the US is sort of a powerful enough trade partner, they can try to create their own sort of side deal with the EU, whereas smaller developing countries going to the EU can't really do that. So if we start to see more countries thinking about a carbon border adjustment, say against China, which had its high carbon intensity, big role in trade, what's the more likely outcome there? Do we think it's going to really encourage them to be more ambitious in their domestic policies? Or do we think we're going to spur some kind of specialized side agreement between China and some of its major trade partners?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I'm no China expert, so I can theorize. But one of the fears that comes up in this conversation is that we've got all this promising area of new climate policy making, and it's just going to cause the global trading system to sort of bifurcate into a G7 block and a China block, and every other country will figure out where it wants to sit. That just doesn't seem very likely. So yes, the US wants to figure out how to negotiate a new agreement with the European Union, but that's for a couple of reasons. The goods covered by the CBAM, the US just doesn't export a lot to the European Union. I think it's less than $3.4 billion in total trade every year will get impacted by the reporting scheme. And then where we are trading with the European Union, we have a carbon advantage over other exporters to the EU. So if the US and China are going head to head in the European market with the CBAM, we're going to win. And I think of the US finding sort of new openings for a trade negotiation, less about trying to move away from the CBAM or get some sort of exception, and more about finding new ways to leverage what we're documenting as an advantage in the US economy on the global scale. So that's the US. I wouldn't think of it as a bid for special treatment, but more of a yes and in how we can move forward. China's a little bit more interesting. At the same time that the European Union was rolling out the regulations associated with data transparency for the CBAM, China came out with a new economic security initiative where they won't allow the reporting of energy consumption information. Yes, and so how can exporters from China to the EU comply with these new requirements in the CBAM? Great question. And I think that tension is really interesting because there are companies operating in China, engaging in trade with the EU, who want positive pressure on transparency so they can keep trade open. And that's sort of butting up against the domestic politics in China that want more control over how data gets shared. And this is a really interesting opportunity to see if global trade, the positive impacts of trade engagement with partners is enough positive pressure on that marketplace to create openings for transparency and more data sharing or not. I'm pretty excited to see how that goes. But I'm not terribly worried that we'll see like a G7 and a China block. I think it's going to be a whole lot more productive than that.
Right. So we'll take questions from the audience. If you want to raise your hand, I will pass around the mic. As a reminder, questions are sentences that end with question marks.
Bill Hogan from the Kennedy School. So first, thank you for this presentation, and thank you for Joe Aldy's good judgment. This is terrific and interesting. So I have a question for you about the distinction between marginal and average effects. And if we adopted your first best climate policy that you're recommending for the United States, and we got a carbon price and dividend for every in the world, and they all had it, then if you ask me, what is the carbon intensity of imports to the United from China, I would say, I don't know and I don't care. Okay, so because what you're measuring is average effects, and what we're interested in from the global impact is marginal effects. This is if we had linear technologies where everything was proportional, they would be the same, but we don't. So now that's, as is evidenced by your diversity of the different kinds of technologies, and some that are cleaner than others. How much of this is a problem where average is what we know how to measure and marginal is what we care about, but they're not the same thing?
Yeah. Oh, it's a really interesting question for policymakers because I feel like I've been banging my head against a wall of carbon pricing for at least 16 years. And in that context, we think often about, oh, well, if we only had a carbon price, we would fix the problem, which is not entirely true. What we need are a lot of different policy solutions working in unison, and some are aiming to, they're all aiming to address sort of different aspects of the problem. And so in concert, if we're layering these kinds of trade and accountability approaches on top of other means of decarbonization, both government-led and private industry-led, because we have more trade, we're making technologies more affordable, we're offering, the opportunity to transform, for example, steel manufacturing overseas. It doesn't have to follow the high carbon pathway. We can export our EAF technologies and decarbonize. If we're doing all of those things together, then we'll be able to address the climate problem. I think the problem is that we are asking any one solution that seems sort of poised for passage and adoption to address all of the climate problem, and it's just simply poorly suited to the task. And so this is an opportunity to ask sort of how can we use a new area of policymaking to contribute to problem solving rather than sort of take on the effort of solving the whole problem together. That's why we're talking about something on the order of 5% of global emissions if we're able to get global production that we're importing to match our intensity. That's it's only 5%, but it's a big part of the problem if we're sort of cracking the can on a new toolkit to bring into the conversation.
An important difference among, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm not an expert in this, an important difference, I think, between the different proposals on the table is the extent to which they also would have be associated with a domestic carbon price. And so the motivation for the EU, you should explain all this so that I keep to Joe's rule of it ending with a question, but it would be helpful if you would explain the rationale here from the United States perspective. So one way to reframe this is, suppose that China said, what we're going to really do is we're going to just subsidize the heck out of our steel industry, just for pick an example. But it's not fair if we just do that. What we have to do is also impose some duties on imported steel. And that doesn't make any sense at all. That wouldn't survive under the WTO. But putting aside the legalistic, it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, the reason that the EU situation works is because they have the ETS, and then the CBAM, deals with the flight problem. So maybe you could just discuss the justification. The justification seems robust if you have a domestic carbon price. It seems a lot less robust if you have a domestic carbon, low carbon subsidy.
Yeah, super interesting question. A live area of discussion amongst the policymakers working on this. I've heard this argument: if we don't have a domestic price, why are we charging imports based on their carbon intensity? What are we adjusting for at the border? I have heard that question. I've also heard the question, how can we ensure the hundreds of billion-dollar investment in the IRA is going to facilitate decarbonizing the domestic economy? Appropriately cultivate the kinds of supply chains we're interested in exporting so that the global economy can decarbonize too. How can we ensure that will happen in an environment where we're seeing major supply chains be subsidized in a dirty fashion overseas, those same supply chains threatening domestic production of lower carbon goods? So as a protection for these major investments we're making to decarbonize the domestic economy, we should introduce a system of accountability for imports from countries that aren't pulling their weight. I've heard both justifications. I've heard both justifications from climate-oriented folks. And so it's not just a tension between Are we doing enough on domestic climate policy? Should we be doing more on domestic climate policy? It's really attention about what are these new accountability features designed to do? Is it to adjust at the border for an internal policy? Is it to effectuate a change in the carbon intensity of what we're importing? Is it to insulate the domestic market from improper competition? And that question about the why is happening right now. And I think we're seeing an openness to imposing these border measures that you can, if you're low carbon, you don't have to pay a lot. Maybe you don't have to pay anything at the border. But imposing them not just because we have some domestic carbon price in place, but because we want to create appropriate insulation to facilitate the decarbonization of the domestic economy more. How can you make a major capital investment in a steel plant, for example, if your major competitor is getting subsidized by the Chinese government, has really high carbon emissions, pays nothing for their domestic energy consumption, and they're flooding the market at a price point you can't match. You can't justify that capital investment. So it's a really interesting, I don't have answers. I'm sort of reflecting back what the political conversation is digesting right now.
So, and just to follow up, we have two mechanisms. One is WTO. If we think that a particular country is subsidizing a particular industry, another one is just going through our usual tariff procedures. And I think the argument must be that both of those are defective in this case, and that we need this third policy to deal with the foreign, subsidies.
Yeah, I think there's an interest in developing a border measure, a tariff that's more responsive to the precise problem we're trying to solve for, right? So a tariff is inescapable. You pay a tariff. If the payment at the border is tied to the carbon intensity of the good you're trading, you can avoid it by decarbonizing. And so building a more responsive trade system to climate priorities, I think that's of interest. So this last paper on this slide, written by my colleague, Matt Porterfield, he's a environmental and trade attorney, and he's looked at the different defenses for each of these policies, including a domestic decarbonization pathway or not. That might be interesting.
Yeah, I saw this webinar, but the lawyer stuff was over my head.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm a MPP1 here at the Kennedy School. I was wondering, you spoke to the bipartisan support domestically for these kinds of policies, which is great. Do you see any challenges arising to actually getting them passed into law?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of promise, a lot of policymakers really optimistic about making policy in this space on both sides of the aisle, but yes, plenty of obstacles. Some sort of principled opposition to border instruments like we were hearing. If we don't have a domestic carbon price, why would we have a border adjustment? Is the US pulling our weight? Can we introduce this system of accountability if we're not accountable ourselves? It's coming mostly from more climate-oriented people sitting to the left. From the right, why would we price carbon? We don't want to sort of establish a policy that might enable more aggressive domestic climate action. So let's try and avoid the subject altogether. Yeah, there's plenty of reasons to oppose this policy that are being embraced by people on both sides of the aisle, but we're seeing more and more concerted interest in doing something productive. We would not see Brian Deese and Bob Lighthizer support the same exact kind of policy if they didn't think their parties could get behind it. And so sure, there are obstacles, but I think they're addressable even in this sort of political environment that's pretty contentious.
Thank you for your presentation. My name's Ryan. I'm a mid-career MBA, and I struggle personally with figuring out how do we advance climate policy that has cost implications for consumer pocketbooks. And I know you showed the data, it shows people are willing to pay more, but I think it's a difference between the head and the heart. People today have those options and still choose to order on Amazon and AliExpress. The numbers would look the same for human rights violations. I'm sure we see the numbers today. And so my point is to wondering if you all have complementary policies to deal with inflation, because I think there's an issue if we pass climate policy that causes mass uproar because cost inflation, people just see inflation and think, oh, well, at least I'm saving the environment. And inflation has the power to overturn governments. extraction industries can ramp up quickly, but manufacturing takes years of capital investment to ramp up, and we'll probably never get the cost equivalent. So combating the American dream and prosperity through purchasing power with the environment, what are we going to do to make sure that these maintain progress and we keep these policies moving forward?
Yeah, super interesting question. Yes, this is especially interesting in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, where the government is going to be investing hundreds of billions of dollars. And many people will perceive that to be cost-free, right? And so the way that these costs get passed through to the taxpayer is totally different from, a price on a gallon of gasoline to being able to refinance a home or take out a loan for school or get Social Security someday. And so these fiscal issues they're really interesting. How do people perceive the costs of government policy? And I think that we have found on the whole that voters have not perceived major cost increases related to trade policy changes. We had a lot of trade policy changes under the Trump administration, and polling never linked any changes in prices related to that to like a consumer awareness that this was a factor, which is, I think, really interesting sort of academic consideration that trade policy seems to be somewhat untethered from how people perceive domestic economic policy making, which I think is interesting. But more broadly, yes, we need to figure out how to balance the policies that we're developing so that they're durable over time. And we have seen in our polling again and again that if we're linking domestic climate policy to job creation, that's really salient. People are willing to pay more for Made in America in a polling question. Figuring out how to translate that into durable policy, I think, comes down to implementation. If we are seeing jobs get created in communities, that support will be durable. If we're not, maybe it won't be as durable. And so to have this conversation, especially in the context of the IRA, which is going to sense into American communities, create jobs in American communities, we might be entering an environment where policies like this can be a lot more durable because people are seeing increased investment in American manufacturing and job creation right now. It's a really interesting question. I don't think I have any answers for it, but I'm asking it too, if it helps.
Great to hear about the carbon advantage. I just want to understand how that would play out at the WTO level. It sounds a lot like protectionism, and I see the American argument for it, but I wanted to ask about the international reaction to that.
Yeah, really interesting. The international reaction, like Joe was saying, is pretty diverse at present. Both sort of interest in figuring out how to achieve this sort of goal of decarbonizing trade. Do we need to adopt differences in sort of domestic policy environments that the goods we trade in are lower carbon, but then also resistance. So India was on the list of countries considering carbon import fees. Their policy hasn't been sort of fully elucidated, but it seems to be in the orbit of, we'll have a system of accountability for historic emissions as a reminder to the G7 economies of who got us into this mess in the first place. And it's a pretty interesting idea. And so diverse responses. How would the carbon advantage work in practice? Yeah, we would have emission-informed supply chains. And the consequences of that are pretty interesting. So depending on who your sort of target markets are, you'll have different incentives to decarbonize more rapidly, to take on more investment in decarbonizing domestic industry, to consider the kinds of goods that you're trading internationally. It's a pretty interesting question. I will note, and this goes to Bill's question, the goods you trade in are not necessarily the goods you produce domestically. And so one of the responses to the European CBAM has been an indication of interest in some markets to identify which portions of manufacturing are the cleanest and which are not so clean, and export what is cleanest. That is not the intention of these trade policies, but in reality, it might be a consequence that we see in the near term. And I think even that is helpful transparency in how the trade system can and cannot impact global decarbonization at scale.
Yes, thanks for sharing. And I have two questions. The first one is a technical one. So when you say the traded carbon flows, you just mean the life cycle emissions of goods or services, and you don't include like the carbon quotas traded in the international carbon market?
That's right. So it's the emission not life cycle, but think of it as like cradle to border. So historic emissions associated with producing a good. That's right.
Yeah, and the second question is that you mentioned the climate club. So I wonder, are there any special mechanisms or characteristics of this club? Seems like it's not just an agreement on border tax.
Yeah. Interesting, also an area of live discussion. So the G7 is having this conversation about developing an inclusive climate club. The idea being that we set a threshold for entry that isn't terribly onerous so that we're getting as many people in with positive incentives as possible. Hasn't been fully elucidated yet. There are other versions of climate clubs that are a lot more harsh. So for example, the Nordhaus model of, I think he calls it a climate club, would require that everybody inside the club has the same domestic carbon price. Everybody outside the club faces a really steep tariff at the border for every good traded in. Onerous model, I don't see a lot of uptake in that in the global economy, but that's just to signal that there's a spectrum of mechanisms that we can rely on to build climate clubs. And right now we're seeing policymakers grapple with how you build mechanisms that create the kinds of incentives we're interested in, given geopolitical interests, economic interests, development interests. So we're seeing this conversation transpire at the G7. We'll see it transpire at the COP later this year in Dubai too.
Hi, Franz Bratson. I'm a 1L at the law school, and for disclosure, I used to work at a climate org that was very aligned with the CLC. So I was curious, I want to talk about political windows. I was curious kind of what your take on when a political window opens to pass a meaningful greenhouse gas reducing policy. How long do those windows stay open? How often do they open? How important is it that climate folks really get behind an opportunity like this to capitalize on the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Great question. So if we're thinking, what does the window look like for the Democrats to be able to pass a bill through a United Democratic Congress and get signed by a Democratic president? Track record's not great for a single party returning to power quickly. And so I think the best that history would have us hope for is something like 13 years from now. We'll see it again and be able to open up that window of opportunity to pass Democrat-only climate policy. That's why this is so important. If we're able to get bipartisan agreement on something that is climate policy, but also other things, then that creates a more sort of durable window of opportunity. So it's not about having united political power. It's about having sort of productive policy-making opportunities in Congress more broadly. Political seasons are wild. And so our opportunity for policymaking may be limited by things that have nothing to do with the priorities at hand. But that we are building political consensus because of climate and economic and geopolitical interests ensures that when policymaking windows open, they are more durable. So for example, members of the Senate are thinking what elements of this might fit in a CHIPS 2.0 and a China 2.0 bill. That's an opportunity to pass something that could be bipartisan sooner rather than later. They're thinking next year or the following. And so plenty of opportunity if we're able to unite political parties to find ways to work towards the same policy, but for different authentic reasons.
Thanks. Dimitri Courant, I'm a researcher at the Ash Center. I was just confused by one thing you said. You said we need more trade, not less trade at some point. And maybe it's my ignorance, but I think no, actually we need to reduce the amount of trade because just like shipping something far, that's also imply costs. And just for the European Union, like they are shipping the exact same type of product they're already producing. So it just add cost of shipping things, and I guess locally producing things would be better. And also like shipping more and having more trade means that you produce more. And I guess we need to just produce less in general because resources being limited. The best emission is the emission you don't create, not the one you just limit. But maybe I missed something.
Well, no, I think we agree on that last point. We need to reduce emissions, but that's emissions intensity. So less trade is guaranteed to trap people in poverty. Less trade is guaranteed to trap countries where they are on the development and decarbonization cycle. Less trade means more emissions, not fewer. And so what we need to figure out how to do is reduce the intensity, the carbon intensity of our activities, including shipping. We can decarbonize shipping. It doesn't mean we need less shipping. It means we need fewer carbon emissions from shipping. And so we know that trade is a really positive indicator for development. We know that rich countries emit less. And we know that we need to get decarbonization technologies into the global environment at a scale that we really haven't seen before with energy infrastructure. Those things are only possible with more robust trade. So more trade, but less environmental impact is the aim.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm a MC MPA, mid-career MPA student from Kennedy School. And I'm from the Pacific Islands. And I was just wondering, because there's this new industry that's starting off renewable energy transition, I just wondered if there has been any discussion about tying such, a carbon tax, whatever you call it. Sorry, didn't mean to say tax.
Come to Washington.
An import fee on goods, if you tie it in with other externalities that could develop as a result of this renewable energy transition. Thanks.
Yeah, such a great question. And I think this goes to your point too, to decarbonize the global economy, we need a lot more minerals. Taking those minerals out of the ground and making them useful has environmental consequences. How do we mitigate that? Super interesting question. While the conversation to date has been about adapting something that's been in the sort of climate conversation for a while, a border carbon adjustment into this new space. Yeah, we're seeing interest in using trade tools for other environmental outcomes. That gets handled often in the context of individual free trade agreements. But if we can figure out how to make sort of unilateral or bilateral, plurilateral policymaking for climate in traded goods, why not? For other reasons too, including broader environmental impacts, including the security of supply chains, including human rights considerations. We're seeing a reconsideration of ensuring that the trading system is consistent with sustainable development goals. Because at present, it seems like the trading system is an inhibition to achieving sustainability and an inhibition to achieving sort of appropriate sustainable development in economies that are trying to get sort of up the ladder of development. So yes, the opportunity is open. This is a really new area of policymaking. The term carbon loophole was only coined 5 years ago. And so we're seeing sort of more and more opportunities come into this space. We don't have a test case yet. I think the test case is going to come from the climate space, and we'll see how we do. What we need to figure out how to do is get the right data. So how do you track this at the border? What are you tracking? How do you introduce a system of accountability? We need data for that. And so we're pretty far along in developing data for climate. How do we develop this data for other environmental impacts too? I think it's interesting. Work on that and then tell me what the answer is.
Hello, I am Narendra. I'm an MPIT student. Thank you for your presentation. It seemed more like us versus them presentation, like China, Russia versus US. And it's like American business meets American politics. Like it's like both centers align. But I have a question, like BRICS share, the 5 countries share of purchasing power GDP is 32% of world GDP. G7 is 29% of world GDP by PPP. So they already exceed G7. So what if they also, like, how do we make this a win-win game rather than a zero-sum game?
Yeah.
Because if each country bargains for itself, how will the environment win? Like it's like EU and EU giving subsidy and with the CBM, and US also now in the process of same, like EU, US versus the other side. But how will it seems like a zero sum. Is there a way to make it? Because the other countries are at the receiving end of the climate change also, like Pakistan, for example. It is in very bad shape because of the climate change. And it doesn't have money to de-intensify its industry, like carbonify in its industries. So it's like increasing inequality at the world level. So like, is there a way to like make it better, make the program better?
Yeah, that's exactly. So I didn't have a lot on carrots, right? So the stick's pretty well elucidated. We have a stick now, it's the European CBAM. But sticks work best when there are also carrots. And that's the system that we need to develop now. Our ability to develop carrots, we might have to navigate around certain countries in the sort of global ecosystem of interest here. China is signaling no interest whatsoever in sharing information necessary to build these systems. They've signaled no interest in building something similar into their economy. Indeed, they might even make it more difficult to trade lower carbon goods if they're not sharing information. So that's one country, but India has signaled a whole lot of interest. Interest not just in being at the table, but in setting the policy conversation for what it means to be accountable for the emissions associated with traded goods today. Shouldn't we think of our history? Shouldn't we think of where we need to get to? Marrying this conversation of accountability with those carrots. How do we bring countries to the table? How do we open up trade in what we want to see more of? How do we ensure that participating in a climate club gives you access to lower carbon goods, favorable investment? How do you have the sort of long-term planning for being an enmeshed member of a global supply chain in key decarbonization goods? All of these fall in that carrots bucket that we're just behind on developing. And behind is a very relative term because the CBAM only started existing yesterday. So we're going to get there. We're in this really interesting place of developing policy. And so these emerging markets, the question of how to bring them to the table on climate accountability by providing these long-term economic incentives to support, yes, sustainable development, but also just development. I think that's a really interesting conversation. And for the first time ever, trade is on the agenda at the International Climate Dialogue. The WTO will be there. And I think it presents us a really interesting opportunity to platform this specific conversation in the context of achieving our global climate goals. How do we build a system where we're having accountability and this opportunity to decarbonize these incentives in place at the same time to bring emerging markets along? Because they are dealing with the brunt of climate change. They have fewer resources to adapt. They want to develop. And we can sort of use that as an opening to pair these two systems together. So I'll be at COP. Let me know if you'll be there too.
So Catrina, let me ask our last question before we wrap up. For the last 50, 60 years, one could argue the US has been a key leader in a rules-based system of international trade. One could say in a bipartisan basis over the last half dozen years, we are a less reliable partner on trade. We have not been a consistently reliable partner on climate over the last 30 years, going back to the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. So when we think about moving forward and what the US might do in policy here, how can it be, let's say, sold? Let's talk about it as sort of a marketing exercise with our partners around the world as a sign of promoting a credible, durable climate policy for the US that everyone should think about engaging with in a positive manner, as opposed to, and this may get back to the zero-sum question earlier, as opposed to sparking a kind of conflict, whether it's on trade policy or climate policy or both. How do we take this and say, no, we're really going to work with everyone moving forward when we've lost a good bit of our credibility in that over the past few years?
How are we going to sell this to our international partners? Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think one of the reasons that we haven't been a reliable trade partner in the last few years comes down to the US grappling with the consequences of the free trade system as it exists today. Some think of free trade as trade with no accountability for anything at all, building and opening markets, exercising limited control over the goods that we end up importing at the end of the day because we'll just take what's ever cheapest. That's been the trend, and it has not worked for the American economy. We are dependent, for example, the global solar supply chain, somewhere between 94 and 99% of it runs through China. A substantial portion of silicone manufacture happens at facilities that use forced labor. Our global trading system cannot introduce a system of accountability for that on its own. And so we're rethinking what the global trading system should look like. How do we use rules-based trade to think about rules too. I think that's a really interesting thing that we're creating sort of value add in the conversation for right now. And frankly, a conversation that many of our international partners also want to see happen in the international trading system. On the climate side, sure, yeah, we've been in fits and stops a productive partner on the global climate conversation, but we are seeing trend setting in industrial decarbonization in particular. We have a knack for finding cool ways to spend money to decarbonize and then exploiting those ways better than any other market. And so at the same time that we might not be sort of at the vanguard of climate ambition in a sort of international policy landscape for every president that we've had recently, we sure are showing what it looks like to decarbonize our economy with the tools we have available. And so I challenge the premise that we haven't been a reliable partner, because the things that we're contributing are really material and I think signal where we need to get to. But how do we sell it to our partners? An interesting question. And we're going to see a lot of that happen at the international stage now. President Biden's US trade representative focuses a lot on making sure that the trading system also helps us achieve domestic policy goals. And so she's traveling the world trying to figure out how to pair this outlook. How to create more jobs in the United States? How do we increase investment in manufacturing in the United States? With how do we secure supply chains and work more closely with target partners that we know we will need to rely on forever for imports and that we want to export to? And so she is plowing the field right now. And we're going to see something similar on climate. I think we're going to pivot from what do we need to do to get China to the table to what do we need to do to build a table that China wants to sit at. And I think that's introducing a level of rigor in the international conversation that will be attractive to our international partners, but we do have to accomplish the sales job first.
Great, thank you. Before we wrap up, an announcement. We will not meet next Monday. It's a university holiday, so we'll meet again in 2 weeks here, and we'll be meeting in this seminar room for the rest of the semester. In 2 weeks' time, Anna Unruh-Cohen, who is the Senior Director for Infrastructure, Clean Energy, Infrastructure, and the National Environmental Policy Act at the Council on Environmental Quality. That's a big portfolio. She'll be joining us for a talk. And finally, please join me in thanking Catrina Rorke for her presentation and insights today. Thank you so much, Catrina.
Thank you. That's awesome.